The mountains did not care about her. That was the first thing Nora Callahan had understood when she drove her truck up the switchback road in the early winter of 2007 and did not come back down for 3 months. The Sangre de Cristo Range, rising sharp and indifferent above the high desert of northern New Mexico, did not ask what she had done or where she had been. The ponderosa pines did not lower their branches in sympathy. The wind that came off the peaks before dawn did not soften itself for her. The mountains simply stood as they had stood for millions of years before she arrived, and would stand for millions after she was gone. And in that absolute indifference, Nora had found the first real silence she had known in years. She was 54 years old now. The woman who had driven up that road all those years ago had been younger in body, but ancient in the way that mattered. She had come here to disappear, and by every practical measure she had succeeded. The cabin sat at 8,200 feet, tucked against the eastern face of a ridge that blocked the worst of the afternoon wind. It was small, one main room with a wood stove, a kitchen corner with a propane burner, a back room barely large enough for a cot and a footlocker. The previous owner had built it as a hunting camp and had died before ever using it. Nora had paid Kate. She had never learned the man's name and had never needed to. She kept the place clean in the way of a person who has learned that disorder is a luxury. Tools hung on their designated hooks. Firewood was stacked with an almost military precision against the south wall of the porch. Her rifle, a bolt action, she trusted, absolutely rested on two wooden pegs above the door. She maintained it the way some people maintain prayer, without joy, but without neglect. Her hair had gone the color of winter ash, cut short enough to stay out of her eyes. Her face was the face of a woman who had spent 2 decades outdoors, in all weather, scored with lines darkened by altitude and sun, stripped of anything that wasn't load-bearing. Her hands were the most honest part of her. The knuckles were thick. The palms were mapped with old scars, some from wire, some from rock. One long, pale seam along the left that she did not think about anymore. When she worked splitting wood, patching fencing, hauling water, when the line froze, those hands moved with an economy that had no wasted motion in it. She had been trained to move that way. She had never unlearned it. 4 times a year she drove down the mountain. Not 3 times, not 5, 4. The number had been established in the first year and had not changed since. Winter before the worst of the cold set in. Early spring before the mud made the track impassable. Midsummer, which she timed to a Tuesday, when the tourists that flooded Taos were most likely to be distracted by the art galleries and the restaurants and least likely to be crowding the feed store. And again in fall before the first real snow. She bought flour, salt, coffee, kerosene, and fuel for the truck. She spoke to no one unless spoken to, and even then she kept her answers to the minimum number of syllables the situation required. The people in Taos knew of her in the way that small towns know of their permanent mysteries. The woman from the mountain, she paid she did not linger. The younger staff at the feed store had theories, widowed or strange or both. The older ones, the ones who had been there long enough, did not theorize. They simply nodded when she came in and did not try to make conversation. Over time, even this small courtesy had come to feel like a form of respect. It was a Tuesday in October, the sky the deep particular blue that only appears at altitude in autumn, when Nora made the drive down. The truck was a 3/4-ton Ford from the early 1990s, bought for its mechanical simplicity and its indifference to comfort. The heater worked on one setting. The radio had been disconnected years ago. The cab smelled of pine resin and motor oil, and the faint ghost of the tree that had ridden in the passenger seat for 2 years before she had stopped allowing herself that particular form of company. She drove with both hands on the wheel, her eyes on the road, her face carrying the particular blankness of a person who has trained themselves not to think about the thing they are always thinking about. The road into Taos took her south along the valley floor through Pinon and Chamisa scrubland, past the scattered ranches and the hand-lettered signs for firewood and hay. She had driven this road enough times to know every bend, every cattle guard, every place where the asphalt had cracked and been patched and cracked again. It required no thought, which meant her mind was left to do what it always did on the drive down. She did not allow it to go very far. The Taos County Animal Shelter sat on the eastern edge of town, a concrete block building behind a chain-link perimeter fence with a small gravel parking area in front. It was not a place that made any effort toward optimism. The sign out front was sun-faded. The chain link had rust along the bottom edge. There were no flower boxes, no cheerful painted murals of the kind that some shelters use to soften the reality of what happened inside. It was a facility performing a function that the community needed and preferred not to think about too closely. Nora never looked at it directly. For years, her method had been to fix her gaze on the opposite side of the road as she passed a stretch of open scrubland running toward the base of the mountains, unremarkable and therefore safe. She drove a little faster through this section. Not much, just enough. Today she could not. The sound reached her before the building was fully in view. It cut through the closed windows and through the ambient noise of the truck's engine, and it stopped her body before her mind had fully processed what she was hearing. It was not the ordinary sound of a shelter, the layered, resigned barking that was always present and always heartbreaking. This was something different. This was a single voice, deep, explosive, rhythmically percussive, like something being fired from a machine rather than made by a living animal. And underneath it, or perhaps alongside it, the heavy metallic slam of a large body hitting a hard surface with full force, over and over. And then a man's voice, sharp with shock and with pain. Nora's foot came off the accelerator. She told herself not to stop. The voice she had cultivated over 15 years, the one that had kept her on the mountain and out of the world, spoke up promptly and with conviction. This was not her situation. This was not her problem. She had no standing here, no responsibility, no claim. She had come down for flour and salt and coffee and fuel. She had a list. She had a routine. She had a life organized specifically so that moments like this, moments requiring something from her that she was no longer certain she had, would not occur. The truck slowed. She pulled onto the gravel shoulder 50 yards short of the shelter's gate. Through the chain link she could see two men. One was in a county uniform, a man in his early 40s she did not know, and he was stumbling backward from a transport kennel mounted on the side of a county vehicle. His right arm was clutched to his chest. Dark staining spread through the heavy canvas of his sleeve. His face was white with shock, and the shock was already converting itself, as shock often does, into anger. The second man was older, broad-shouldered, wearing the look of someone who had seen too much and had developed a professional patience about it. He stood between the first man and the kennel, speaking in a tone Nora could not hear. Inside the kennel, a German shepherd was destroying itself against the metal door. Gray and white large, probably 90 pounds. It was throwing itself at the door in a rhythm that seemed beyond volition. Lunge, impact, spin, lunge again, as if the body had been seized by something the mind could no longer regulate. The sound it made was not a bark in any ordinary sense. It was a raw, continuous detonation of terror. Nora watched. She watched the way she had been trained to watch, with her whole field of vision open, rather than focus, taking everything in without landing on any one thing. She watched the dog's body, not the motion of it, but the architecture beneath the motion. The position of the ears, the angle of the head, the specific quality of the eyes. The ears were not forward. They were not the ears of an aggressive animal issuing a challenge. They were pinned so far back against the skull that they seemed to have disappeared into the ruff of fur at the neck. The eyes were wide, not narrowed in threat, but blown open, showing white all around the iris, the pupils dilated past the point of seeing anything clearly. The body was not coiled with predatory intent. It was trembling, a deep, fine, ceaseless trembling that ran through the muscle and bone the way current runs through wire. But it was the head that stopped her breathing. Between lunges, the dog's head would snap upward. The muzzle pointed at the sky. The gaze swept along the roofline of the shelter building, tracked across the open space of the parking area, swept back. Not looking at the men in front of it, not focused on the threat at its own level. Looking up, scanning the high ground. Nora's hand, which had been resting on the gear shift, went still. She knew that posture. She knew it the way she knew the weight of her own body, the way she knew the sound of the wind before a storm. She had seen it once before in her life, produced by an animal she had known better than she had known most people, and the last time she had seen it, the world had ended. Rex had moved exactly this way, head up, eyes wide and white, ears flat, body trembling not with aggression but with a terrible specific knowledge. Scanning the high ground, because he had been trained to find threats that came from above, because in the places they had worked together, threats very often did come from above. And because a dog trained at that level does not forget. He had shown her that posture once in the last moments before the explosion that had taken him from her, and she had spent every year since then wishing she had understood sooner what it meant. This dog was not attacking. This dog was not vicious. This dog was looking for a bomb. Nora turned off the engine. The silence of the cab was sudden and absolute. She sat in it for 3 seconds. Then she opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel. The uniformed officer Travis Cole, she would learn his name later, saw her first. His face already raw with pain and anger contracted further. She could see him reading her a woman in her 50s, worn brown leather jacket over a flannel shirt. The color of dried blood jeans faded to the particular gray of long use boots that had covered serious terrain. No uniform, no badge, no obvious reason to be walking toward a situation that didn't involve her. The older man turned. He had a sheriff's bearing, the kind that doesn't leave a person even years after the badge has been put away. He looked at her without the suspicion Travis wore, assessing rather than dismissing. There was something in his eyes that recognized the way she moved. This was Walt Briggs, former Taos County Sheriff, now director of the shelter he had campaigned to keep funded through 3 budget cycles. 62 years old. A man who had learned after decades of managing emergency situations that the most useful thing he could do in any given moment was create space for the person who knew what to do next. Travis spoke first, his voice tight and elevated with pain. "Ma'am, this is not, you need to stay back. This is an active K9, Nora said. She looked at the kennel, not at him. Army, handler. 2 words and a noun. They landed differently than Travis's instruction. He stopped speaking. Walt's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, a slight easing around the eyes, as if a calculation had just completed itself. He did not ask her for credentials. He did not ask her how long ago, or which unit, or what her clearance level had been. He simply turned and walked to the supply shed at the side of the building. He came back carrying a 3-legged milking stool, wooden simple, the kind that had no business in a modern animal shelter, but which sometimes accumulated in outbuildings the way useful things do. He set it on the gravel in front of the kennel. He stepped back without saying anything, that was all. No instructions, no conditions, no welcome and no warning. Just the stool and the space around it. Travis looked at Walt with open disbelief. Walt met his gaze with the calm of a man who has made a decision and does not need agreement to sustain it. Nora walked to the stool. She picked it up. She moved it 3 feet to the left, setting it at an angle so that when she sat, her body was turned partially away from the kennel, not facing the dog, not presenting her back, but offering her side. The position of someone who was present but not confrontational. Someone who had arrived but had no particular agenda. She sat down. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and took out a book. It was a paperback, the cover gone entirely, the pages soft and rippled from years of handling. She opened it to a page roughly in the middle and appeared to begin reading. Ghost, though she did not know his name, yet erupted. The animal in the kennel, which had been at a continuous violent peak since she first heard it from 50 yards down the road, redoubled. The arrival of a new human sitting calmly at close range seemed to be a new and particular outrage. The barking was deafening. The lunges hit the kennel door with an impact she could feel through the soles of her boots on the gravel. Nora turned a page. She did not flinch. She did not look up. She did not adjust her posture or shift her weight. She sat exactly as she had sat, and she turned the page and she continued reading, or appearing to read, while every nerve in her body was focused entirely on the animal 10 feet away. Inside the shelter's small front office, a young man named Cal Merritt had his face pressed close to the window glass. Cal was 27, newly certified as a veterinary technician, idealistic in the way that people who have chosen their profession out of genuine love, rather than practicality, tend to be idealistic. He had been the intake coordinator on the day the gray and white shepherd had arrived. He had been the one to file the paperwork, the one who had taken the photograph for the kennel card, the one who had noted in the record that the dog had not eaten the first day. He watched this woman sit down in front of an animal that had just hospitalized one of their most experienced officers, and he felt the particular anxiety of someone witnessing something that could go very wrong very fast. Walt had come to stand beside him. "What is she doing?" Cal asked. "That dog is going to hurt itself." Watch his breathing, Walt said. Not the movement, the breathing. Cal watched. It took him a moment to see what Walt was pointing at because the movement was so extreme it was hard to see anything else. But gradually he found it the rhythm beneath the chaos. The lunges came in waves. And between the waves, just barely there was a pause. A fractional hesitation. The dog would hit this door, fall back, and in the moment before the next lunge, it would glance at the woman on the stool, one fast involuntary glance. Then it would lunge again. She's not ignoring him, Walt said quietly. She's outlasting him. The barking continued for 40 minutes. Then slowly, like a fire running short of fuel, it began to change. The intervals between lunges grew slightly longer. The quality of the sound shifted, the explosive percussive quality giving way to something lower, rougher. The dog's body was beginning to carry the weight of what it had spent on itself. At 50 minutes, Ghost retreated to the back of the kennel. He did not lie down. He remained on his feet, sides heaving, chest soaked with saliva, eyes still locked on the woman on the stool. But he was not lunging. The deep growl that replaced the barking was constant and seemed to cost him something to maintain. Nora turned another page. Ghost paced. He came forward to the door and growled at the wire. He paced back. He made a sound halfway between a bark and a whine that seemed to express a deep and frustrated confusion. He had deployed everything he had. He had launched the full weight of his considerable terror at this human, and the human had simply continued reading. At 63 minutes, Ghost lay down. Not the full collapse of genuine sleep. He lay with his sternum on the concrete, his head up, every muscle still taut. But he was down. His panting had deepened from the shallow, rapid rhythm of panic into something slower. He was still watching her. But he was watching with something that, for the first time, was not purely terror. It was the beginning of a question. Nora closed her book. She placed it back in her pocket, picked up the stool, and walked back to the office without looking at the kennel. She set the stool beside the door. Walt handed her a cup of coffee without preamble. She took it. "Tomorrow," she said, that was all. She drank half the coffee, handed the cup back, and walked to her truck. She had not bought her supplies. She had been at the shelter for over an hour. She would have to come back into town the next day, which meant breaking the ritual she had maintained without interruption for years. She did not allow herself to think about this. She started the truck and pulled out of the lot. In the kennel behind her, Ghost lay watching the empty space where she had been. The next morning before she came back, Cal Merritt found the paperwork. It was not where it should have been. The man who had surrendered the ball, a heavy-set individual in his late 40s, who had come in with Ghost on a choke chain, pulled tight enough to leave marks, who had dropped a plastic sleeve of documents on the counter and said the dog was broken and needed to be put down or I'll do it myself, had thrown the documents rather than handing them. One had slid off the counter and come to rest under the edge of the reception desk, half hidden against the baseboard. Cal found it when he was cleaning. It was a clear plastic sleeve containing a D Form 2209, the standard military canine medical record, and beneath it, a certificate of discharge from the Department of Defense. Cal stood under the fluorescent light of the empty reception area and read it twice. Ghost, canine designation W612, multi-purpose canine military working dog program, multiple deployments, commendation notation, discharged honorably in 2023. The microchip number matched the chip Cal had scanned on intake. Cal ran the previous owner's plates through the county database. The man had 2 prior citations for animal cruelty. One for a dog found tied outside without water in August. One for a neighbor's complaint that had not resulted in charges, but had generated a report describing a medium-large dog that appeared to have been struck repeatedly about the head. Cal sat down in the reception chair. He stared at the document in his hands. He had been working in animal welfare for 3 years and had never been good at the part where he had to not take it personally. When Nora arrived just after sunrise, Cal was waiting at the entrance to the quarantine wing. He did not say good morning. He held out the plastic sleeve. She took it. She read it standing in the cold hallway, the early light coming through the narrow window at the end of the corridor. She read it the way she had learned to read field reports, quickly, completely registering everything without showing that she was registering anything. Military working dog, honorably discharged, commendation, beaten after he came home. She stood still for a long time. The document was slightly crumpled at one corner, where Cal had folded it back into the sleeve. She smoothed it with her thumb once before she handed it back. She did not say anything. She picked up the three-legged stool that Walt had left in the hallway and walked to Ghost's Run. From her jacket pocket, she took a small square of foil pressed flat. She had prepared it the night before in the cabin. High-value food-dried liver, the kind she had kept for years, out of a habit she had never examined too closely, buying it from the feed store on her quarterly trips with no particular purpose in mind. She unfolded the foil. She did not throw it into the run. She did not try to press it through the chain link. She knelt slowly, ignoring the cold concrete and the protest of her knees, and slid it through the gap at the base of the gate until it rested just inside. Then she stood, walked back to her stool, and sat down. Ghost had exploded at her arrival, the pattern from the day before repeating itself, with only a slight reduction in initial intensity. He was against the back wall, snarling by the time she was seated. He stared at the square of foil on the concrete floor of his run. He stared at her. He stared at the foil again. The standoff lasted most of the morning. The sun moved. The temperature in the concrete corridor rose by a few degrees. Ghost paced and stopped and paced again. His nose was working constantly. She could see it from where she sat, that fine, quick twitching that meant the scent was reaching him despite everything else. He was hungry. He had been hungry for days, eating only what he was certain was safe. Nora read her book, or she held her book and sat and waited. This was not patience in the way most people experience patience, as something that had to be endured. It was something older and more fundamental than that. It was the patience of someone who has learned that time is the only currency that cannot be faked. You could not simulate the passage of time. You could not buy trust with anything other than the sustained, unremarkable proof of your own consistency. She had learned this in a compound in Afghanistan's Kandahar province, working dogs in 120-degree heat, where a handler who got ahead of the animal got both of them killed. She had forgotten that she knew it, or she had known it and had chosen not to use it for a very long time. But the knowledge was still there, stored in the body the way physical knowledge always is deeper than thought. The afternoon came in. At 3:17, Ghost moved. He did not come all the way to the gate. He moved forward, perhaps 4 feet from the back wall, his body low, his movement reluctant as if pulled against his will. He put his nose down toward the foil square. He lifted his head and looked at Nora. He put his nose down again. At 3:41, he ate. He was fast, a quick snap of the head, the foil package gone in an instant, retreating immediately to the back wall, as if ashamed of what he'd done. He stood there with his back to her briefly, then turned around and sat facing her. The growl had stopped sometime in the past hour. He was watching her now with an expression she recognized. Not trust, not even the beginning of trust, but the recognition that something did not follow the pattern he had been taught to expect from human beings. Walt appeared at the end of the corridor just before Nora stood to leave. He had a coffee again. He always seemed to have a coffee at the right moment, as if he maintained a private surveillance of the hallway to time these appearances correctly. Travis came by, he said. Nora accepted the coffee. She said nothing. He filed the official report with the county board. Walt leaned against the wall with the ease of a man who had spent a career learning how to be present without being intrusive. They held an emergency session this morning, insurance company. He paused. 7 days. After that, I have to sign the order. 7 days. The number sat in the air between them. They both understood what it meant. The protocol in these situations was clear and had the force of county ordinance behind it. An animal with a documented aggression incident of this classification level, 4-officer injury requiring medical treatment, could be subject to behavioral euthanasia on a compressed timeline. The shelter director could recommend. The county board had voted. The timeline had begun. Nora looked down the corridor toward Ghost Run. The dog had moved again, she could see from here. He was no longer at the back wall. He was lying 4 feet from the gate. There's an exemption clause, Cal said. He had appeared from the direction of the clinic, a clipboard in his hands, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked slightly out of breath, as if he had been reading fast. Section 7, subsection C, the euthanasia order is suspended if the animal can demonstrate, and I'm quoting, manageable behavior sufficient for safe transport, meaning muzzle acceptance and leash compliance. 20 steps from the kennel to a transport vehicle. He looked up from the clipboard. He looked at Nora. That's it, he said. Not rehabilitation, not adoptability, just 20 steps. Nora did not respond immediately. She was looking down the corridor. Ghost had his head on his paws. His amber eyes were open, watching the spot where she had been sitting all day. He was watching it the way a dog watches a door it expects someone to come back through. 7 days, a muzzle, 20 steps. She had spent 15 years on a mountain becoming very good at refusing to be responsible for anything. She had built the refusal carefully stone by stone, the way you build a wall against a thing you know will come if you give it any opening at all. She had been proud of it in the way that people are sometimes proud of the defenses that are slowly killing them. She looked at the military discharge certificate that Cal was still holding in his other hand. Multi-purpose canine, honorably discharged, beaten after he came home. "I'll need the stool again tomorrow," Nora said. She handed Walt back the coffee cup and walked out to her truck in the lost light of the afternoon, the mountains rising dark and enormous against the sky to the north, the air carrying the first real edge of the coming cold. She sat in the cab for a moment without starting the engine. Tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. 7 days to teach a broken soldier that the world was not still trying to kill him. She started the truck and drove back up the mountain. She slept in the truck on the fourth night. It was not a decision she made so much as a conclusion. She arrived at somewhere around mile 30 of the drive back up the mountain when she calculated the time. 90 minutes up, 90 minutes down, plus the hour she would lose to the cold engine in the morning, and simply turned around. She pulled back into the shelter lot just after 10 killed the headlights, reclined the bench seat as far as it would go, and pulled her jacket over her shoulders like a blanket. The mountains were still up there. She could see them through the windshield, blacker than the sky behind them. The ridgeline she had memorized over 15 years, cutting its familiar silhouette against the stars. They had not moved. They would not miss her tonight, because mountains did not miss anything, which was the quality she had valued in them most. She woke before dawn with a stiff neck and the particular clarity that comes from sleeping in a place slightly too cold and slightly too uncomfortable for the mind to drift far. She could hear Ghost before she opened the truck door. Not the violent barking of the first days, something lower. A continuous, restless movement inside the concrete building, the sound of a large animal that had not slept well either. She went in. The morning routine had established itself with the quiet efficiency of things that happen the same way enough times to become inevitable. Walt arrived 30 minutes after her made coffee in the small kitchen at the back of the office, left a cup on the counter where Nora would find it. Cal arrived at 7:30, checked on the animals in the main adoption wing, then found reasons to be in the area of the quarantine corridor for the first hour of each day. He was not subtle about it. Nora did not comment on it. Each morning, she moved the stool 1 foot closer to Ghost's run. On day 4, the stool was at 7 feet. Ghost's initial explosion lasted 12 minutes rather than the 40 of the first day. When it subsided, he retreated to the back wall and stood facing her, the low growl running underneath everything like a generator that never quite shut off. But he stood. He did not lie down, but he stood without lunging, and standing without lunging was a thing that had not existed 4 days ago. On day 5, the stool was at 6 feet. Ghost did not rush the gate that morning. He was there when she arrived, standing at the back of his run, with his weight slightly forward, watching the door to the corridor. He had been waiting. She did not allow herself to interpret this because interpretation was a way of hurrying, and hurrying was a way of breaking something that was only barely beginning to hold. She set the stool down. She sat. She opened the book. She had read it through twice now. She was reading it a third time without seeing a word of it. The book was not the point. The book was the signal, a consistent, repeatable demonstration of a body in a state of calm. She had explained this to Cal once briefly when he asked why she kept reading the same book. A dog reads the body before it reads the face, she had told him. The body holding a book is a body that is not preparing to attack. That afternoon, Ghost came to the gate. He did not rush it. He moved forward in the same reluctant way he had moved toward the food on the second day, as if pulled by something he resented. He stopped 3 inches from the chain link. He stood there, enormous and trembling, slightly, his black nose working the air between them with a focused intensity that was the most concentrated form of attention a dog possesses. Nora did not look up. She did not move. She breathed slowly and let her left hand drift from the book to her knee, and then over the course of several minutes that she did not rush, She moved it forward until it rested palm out against the chain link, not reaching through, not pushing, simply resting, offering the fact of herself, her scent, her warmth, the specific information encoded in her skin without any demand attached. Ghost Nose found her hand. The moment lasted perhaps 4 seconds. His breath was hot against her palm. Then something shifted in him, some sudden reassertion of the fear, and he scrambled backward, his claws on the concrete, sounding like a drawer of silverware dropped on a tile floor. He was at the back wall again, his sides heaving, staring at her with an expression that was the canine equivalent of having said something he hadn't meant to. Nora did not react. She turned a page. It was Cal who found her in the corridor that evening, long after the rest of the staff had gone. He came with 2 mugs of coffee and the particular expression of someone who had been working up to something for a while and had finally decided to stop working up to it. He held 1 mug out. She took it. They sat in the corridor, their backs against the opposite wall from Ghost's run. Ghost was resting, not fully asleep, but down, his head on his paws, his amber eyes moving from Nora's face to Cal's face and back. "You don't have to answer this," Cal said. He was 27 years old and had good instincts about when not to press. He said it like someone who meant it, not like someone issuing a social formality before pressing anyway. Nora looked at Ghost. "Was it bad over there?" A long silence. Outside the building, the wind had picked up the dry, rasping sound of it against the concrete walls, distinct in the quiet. "His name was Rex," she said. Cal did not move. German Shepherd, black and tan. He could track a target across 2 miles of hard-pan desert in a full sandstorm. She paused. The mug was warm in her hands. "He was the best working dog I ever handled. Better than I deserved, probably." "What happened to him?" She looked at the wall on the far side of the corridor, at the place where the painted concrete had been scuffed by decades of kennel, doors, and equipment carts. She had not said this aloud in many years. She had said it inside her own head so many times that the words had worn smooth like stones in a riverbed, the original edges gone, only the shape remaining. "I gave a bad command," she said. "We'd been working 20 hours. The heat was past anything that should be legal. Rex alerted, gave me the signal, the specific one for a buried device. I knew what it meant. I had seen it 100 times. She stopped. Cal waited. "I hesitated," she said. "Part of me thought he might be wrong, thought maybe he was just tired or the heat was affecting him. I second-guessed him." Her voice did not break. It had the quality of a voice that had already broken so many times it had learned a different way to hold itself together. "I gave him the command to advance, just a few more feet, just to verify." The corridor was very quiet. "The IED detonated," she said. "He was gone before I could reach him." Cal stared at his coffee. "I left after that," she said. "Filed out, drove up the mountain, and I haven't explained myself to anyone since." She looked at Ghost. The dog had raised his head while she was speaking, his ears moving forward for the first time since she had known him, not pinned in fear, but upright, attending to the sound of her voice. 15 years of telling myself it was my fault, that I got my partner killed because I didn't trust him when it mattered. Cal said nothing. There was nothing to say to this, and he seemed to understand that with a maturity beyond his years. He did not offer her absolution or argument. He just sat with her in the fact of what she had said, which was its own form of respect. Ghost put his head back on his paws. His nose pointed toward the gate, toward Nora. She did not remark on this, but she saw it. The next morning, Travis came back. He arrived in his county vehicle at 7:53, which Nora knew because she had been watching the gate since 7:40. She did not know she had been watching it. She told herself she had simply been sitting with her coffee and looking at the lot, which was more or less the same thing. Travis got out of the vehicle. His arm was in a new bandage, lighter than before, but his hand emerging from the sleeve was visibly stiff. He moved with the careful, controlled motion of someone whose body was reminding them of a recent injury with every step. He had a clipboard. He was holding it the way people hold things when they have decided the thing they are holding makes them right. From inside the run, Ghost saw him. The 5 days dissolved in an instant. The dog that had been sleeping 2 feet from the gate, the dog that had come to the wire the day before and breathed the warmth of itself against Nora's palm, was simply gone. In its place was the animal from the parking lot on day one, all terror, and violence hurling itself at the chain link, the sound filling the concrete corridor like something detonating. Travis flinched. It was a small, involuntary convulsion of the whole body, the kind that bypasses the will entirely and happens before the mind can respond. And then in the aftermath of the flinch, his face tightened into something that was not anger exactly, though it looked like anger from the outside. It was harder than anger and older. The conversation that followed was short and unproductive. Travis had the documentation. The board had voted. He was here to formally serve the timeline and to confirm that the facility was in compliance with the county's expectation that the order would be carried out on schedule. He did not look at Nora while he said this. He looked at the clipboard, then at Walt, then at a point on the wall somewhere between them. Nora said nothing. There was nothing she could say to Travis Cole that would matter, and she was experienced enough to know this. Walt walked Travis out. He was gone for perhaps 15 minutes. When he came back, he found Nora in the corridor standing at her stool, but not sitting her arms crossed, watching Ghost gradually exhaust himself against the chain link again. Walt leaned against the wall. He did not open with anything. He was a man who understood the rhetorical value of silence. 5 years ago, he said eventually, Travis was the lead officer on an animal cruelty call. House in the south part of the county. Owner had a pit bull, said the dog was just scared, not dangerous. Said if we could just get it out of the house, it would be fine. Nora watched Ghost. Travis went in himself, Walt said, which was not the protocol, but Travis has always believed in doing the hard parts himself. That's not a small quality in a man. He paused. The dog took him down in the hallway. 60 stitches in the leg, 40 in the arm, nerve damage that the doctors said was permanent. He proved them wrong, but it cost him 8 months and everything he had to give. And he came back to this job because it was his job, and because walking away from it would have meant the dog won something it shouldn't have won. Walt looked at his own hands briefly. He doesn't see Ghost. He sees the hallway. He sees the moment before the dog moved. He has been standing in that hallway for 5 years, and every aggressive dog he encounters is the animal that put him on the floor. Ghost had stopped lunging. He was at the back of his run, again panting, already diminished by the expenditure. The eyes that tracked the space where Travis had been were not the eyes of a predator. They were the eyes of something that had been hurt at a cellular level and had organized its entire existence around the management of that fact. He's not wrong, Nora said. No, Walt agreed. He's not wrong. He's just incomplete. That night, the weather came in. Nora had felt it building through the afternoon, a quality in the air that she recognized from the mountain, a particular stillness that was not calm, but held. The sky had turned a color that experienced high desert people know to respect a yellowish green around the horizon, the clouds stacking themselves in formations that seemed deliberate, organized toward a purpose. She drove up to the cabin because the truck cab was not adequate shelter for what was coming, and she knew it. She drove with the window cracked, watching the sky in her mirrors, and she made it to the cabin and had a fire going in the stove and a can of something heating on the burner when the first strike came. It was not a gentle announcement. It was a direct concussive detonation overhead, the kind of thunder that is not heard so much as received, felt through the floor, through the walls, through the sternum, the kind that does not remind you of anything gentle. Nora was on the floor before she understood she had moved. She was on the floor, her back against the wall, beside the wood stove, her knees drawn up, her hands over the back of her head, and the thing that was happening inside her chest was not controllable by the rational mind, because the rational mind had temporarily vacated the premises. The rational mind had been replaced by a set of physical memories that did not respect the distinction between 2007 and the present moment, that did not acknowledge the difference between a mountain in New Mexico and a compound in Afghanistan, that heard a loud concussive sound and acted accordingly. She stayed on the floor for 3 minutes. The storm raged above the cabin. Lightning hit somewhere on the ridge to the north, close enough that the light and the sound arrived almost simultaneously. She breathed. She counted. She felt the wooden floor under her palms and reminded herself with each number that this was a floor she had put down herself, that the knot in the third board from the wall was a knot she had worked around, that this was her floor, in her cabin on her mountain. Eventually she got up. She stood at the window and watched the storm work itself out across the valley. 40 miles south, the shelter's concrete walls were doing what concrete does with sound. Amplifying it, compressing it, returning it to the air inside changed. The thunder that reached the quarantine corridor did not sound like thunder. It sounded like the pressure wave of something massive and destructive moving through enclosed space. Ghost was asleep when the first crack hit. He was on his feet before the echo died. He was at the gate before the second strike. He hit the chain link door at full speed, the latch already compromised from the impacts of the previous days, the metal fatigued around the housing in ways that Cal had noted and flagged for repair, but which had not yet been addressed, taking the full weight of 90 pounds of terrified animal moving at velocity. The latch held on the first impact. It held on the second. On the third, the housing pulled from the frame with a sound like a gunshot and the gate swung outward, and Ghost was through it before the door had finished moving. He ran the length of the corridor in 3 seconds. He hit the locked front entrance and rebounded. He turned. He ran toward the clinic at the back of the building. He found the large intake flap designed for passing equipment and supply bins, far larger than a standard cat door, and he went through it on instinct and momentum, tumbling out into the full violence of the storm. He ran into the dark and the rain and the thunder, all of which sounded exactly like the thing he feared most. And he ran not toward anything but away from everything, which is the only direction Tara knows. Nora's phone rang at 3:14 in the morning. The landline mounted to the kitchen wall, the one she had kept connected for emergencies and had used twice in 15 years. Its mechanical bell was loud enough to hear from the back room, loud enough to yank her out of a half-sleep she had finally managed at close to 2. She was at the phone in 4 steps. He's gone. Cal's voice was high and thin in a way that told her he had been awake for some time, before calling that he had probably spent part of that time hoping the situation would resolve itself before he had to make this call. The storm the latch gave. He's been out for at least 2 hours. Nora Travis was here when I found it. He's gone after him. She was already pulling on her boots one-handed. Where would Travis go? The high ground north of town, the old mining tract. Cal's voice fractured briefly. He had a rifle, Nora. He called it in as an escaped dangerous animal. It's legal. He has every right under the county ordinance to call Walt, she said. She hung up. She looked at the window where the storm was beginning to exhaust itself, the lightning moving east, the thunder arriving with a longer delay between flash and sound that meant distance. She looked at the phone on the wall. She looked at the jacket on the hook by the door. Then she looked at the wallet on the kitchen table. She kept a piece of paper in the back of it. She had kept it there for 15 years without ever taking it out, the way people keep things they cannot bring themselves to either use or discard. It was folded into quarters, soft from age, the ink faded but still legible. A name, a number, written in the quick slanted handwriting of a woman who moved fast and wrote the same way. Patrice Holbrook, Staff Sergeant, Forward Operating Base Salerno, 2006 and 2007. The person who had been on Nora's left on the worst day of Nora's life. The person Nora had not spoken to since she filed her separation papers, packed her gear and drove north out of Fort Carson with no destination in mind except away. Nora did not make the call from the cabin. She drove down to the 24-hour gas station on the highway junction, the one with the payphone bolted to the wall outside by the air compressor, because she did not know why, because some calls needed to be made from somewhere that was not home, because home was the place you returned to after you had done something irreversible, and this felt like that kind of thing. The lot was empty. The fluorescent lights of the car station canopy hummed in the wet air. She dialed. The coin dropped. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, a voice answered. Awake, not the voice of someone woken up, but the voice of someone who had been lying in the dark, not sleeping. Holbrook, it's Nora. The silence lasted long enough that she could hear the electric hum of the open line. When Patrice spoke again, her voice had a quality that Nora recognized from the field, the quality of a person who has just switched modes, who has just set aside whatever they were carrying and picked up something else. 15 years, Patrice said. Where are you? New Mexico. I need to ask you something. You left. The controlled quality in Patrice's voice cracked slightly around the word. You just left Nora. No address, no number. I thought, Rex, Nora said. I need you to tell me what you remember. Another silence, longer than the first. I remember all of it, Patrice said. I remember every second of it. I've had 15 years to remember it. I gave the command to advance, Nora said. I hesitated, and then I sent him forward. I've been living with that. I need to know if that's what you remember too. The sound that came through the line was not agreement. It was something sharper than that, something that had been held under pressure for a long time. You think it was your command, Patrice said slowly. Not a question. It was my command. Nora, Patrice's voice had changed again. There was something raw in it now, something that had not been there a moment ago. Rex didn't move because of your command. The gas station hummed. A truck moved through on the highway, its lights sweeping briefly across the far edge of the lot and then gone. He found a secondary device, Patrice said. We didn't know it was there. It was a decoy set up, the first device to pull in the EOD team, the second one aimed at anyone who came to help clear it. Rex found the second one. He had already found it by the time you gave any command at all. She stopped. When she continued, her voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. I stepped off the line, Nora. I was moving toward what I thought was the safe side, and Rexy came off his position and hit me, knocked me sideways, put himself between me and the pressure plate. Nora stood in the cold, wet air and did not speak. He wasn't following your command, Patrice said. He was covering me. He made that decision himself the same way they always do when it matters most. He died saving my life. She was quiet for a moment. Not because of anything you did, not because of anything you failed to do. The fluorescent light above Nora buzzed and flickered once. Somewhere on the highway, another truck passed in the dark. Then why did I leave? Nora said. It was not quite a question. It was something she was saying aloud for the first time, and the sound of it in her own voice was the sound of something that had been kept in a locked room for a very long time and was finally reluctantly being let out. Patrice did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was not unkind, but it was honest in the way that only old familiarity permits. Because you're the kind of person who needed it to be your fault, she said. Because if it was your fault, then you were in control of it. And if Rex died because of something you did, then at least it had a reason. Another pause. And because you ran, Nora. You packed up and you ran and you left the rest of us to figure out what to do with a hero and no one to help us honor him properly. The words were not delivered with cruelty. They were delivered the way a diagnosis is delivered by someone who has earned the right to make it without gentleness, but also without pleasure. I've been carrying that story for 15 years, Patrice said. The true one, the whole one. By myself. Nora stood in the buzzing light. The storm had moved far enough east that the sky directly overhead was clearing, stars beginning to appear in the gaps between the retreating clouds. The mountains were out there in the dark, unchanged, indifferent, exactly as she had left them. She had driven to this mountain because she believed she was guilty of a specific terrible failure. She had organized her entire life around the management of that guilt, had made her peace with it in the cold, disciplined way of a person who has decided that punishment is preferable to hope. She was not guilty of that failure. She was guilty of something else entirely. Something smaller in some ways and larger in others. Not a bad command given in a moment of exhaustion and doubt. Not a split-second failure in the field. Something slower and more deliberate. A choice made over days and weeks in the separation papers, in the drive north out of Fort Carson, in the 15 years of not calling a number she had kept in the back of her wallet since the day she left. She had abandoned the story. She had left Patrice to carry it alone because carrying it herself, even imperfectly, even as a lie, was more than she could manage. Rex had died a hero, and Nora had let that heroism sit unwitnessed for 15 years because she could not face the grief of it. I have to go, she said. I know. Patrice's voice was tired. Not the tiredness of the hour, a deeper tiredness that sounded like the particular exhaustion of someone who has maintained a long vigil and can now maybe allow themselves to set it down. What are you going to do? Nora looked north toward the mountains, toward the high ground, where a dog was running alone through the aftermath of a storm with an armed man somewhere behind him. Something I should have done a long time ago, she said. She hung up the phone. She stood in the empty lot for a moment longer, the wet gravel dark and shining under the lights, the air cold and clean after the rain. Then she walked to her truck and drove north. The trailhead parking area was lit by the headlights of 3 vehicles when Nora arrived, and the scene they illuminated had the frozen, overexposed quality of something happening too fast to be real. Two county trucks sat at hard angles parked the way vehicles are parked when the person driving them has decided that the situation in front of them is more important than the vehicle. A younger officer she did not recognize leaned against the nearer one. His arms crossed his face, carrying the expression of someone who has been placed somewhere and told to stay. Walt's old police interceptor was pulled sideways across the access road, blocking the trail entrance entirely. Walt himself stood in front of it, and Travis Cole stood at the mouth of the trail with a rifle. It was slung, not raised, not pointed, but the way he held himself around it communicated that the status could change. His face in the headlight wash was pale and set, and the hand that rested on the stock was the hand that had been mauled 5 years ago. The fingers not quite straight, the grip not quite what it had been. He was wearing his uniform, and his expression was the expression of a man who has decided that procedure is the last solid thing in a shifting world, and he is going to stand on it no matter what. Cal was there too, standing between Travis and the trail in the particular way of someone who is not large enough to be a physical impediment, but has decided to be one anyway. His hands were at his sides, his chin up. He looked terrified, and he was not moving. Nora got out of the truck. She did not hurry. She closed the door behind her and walked toward the group at a pace that communicated neither urgency nor indifference, the pace of someone who has arrived at the place they are supposed to be and is now ready to do the thing they are supposed to do. Her boots were loud on the wet gravel in the pre-dawn quiet. Travis saw her first. "You need to stay back," he said. "This is an act of containment. I have a county ordinance authorization for—" "I know what you have," Nora said. She kept walking. She stopped about 15 feet from him in the space between his position and Cal's, and she stood there and looked at him the way she had looked at Ghost on the first day, not confrontationally, not submissively, but with a direct and sustained attention that did not waver. Travis looked back at her. Something moved behind his eyes that was not anger and not confidence. The hand on the rifle stock shifted slightly. "That animal is a public safety threat," he said. "It's loose, it's injured, it's cornered somewhere up that trail. And when a dog like that gets cornered—" "I know what happens when a dog like that gets cornered," Nora said. The words were quiet. They were not a challenge. They were simply true, delivered by someone withstanding to deliver them, and they landed in the cold air between the two of them with a weight that Travis's procedural authority could not quite match. Walt moved then. He came around the front of the interceptor without hurrying, his hands at his sides, wearing the old department windbreaker he had pulled on over whatever he had been sleeping in when Cal called him. The faded letters across the breast were barely legible in the dark. He walked until he was standing slightly ahead and to the right of Travis, which put him in the position of someone who is not confronting another person, but who has simply arrived at the place that matters. He looked at Travis for a long moment. The look had nothing aggressive in it. It was the look of a man who has known another man for a long time and understands him well enough to know what the moment costs him. "Travis," Walt said, "give it to me." Travis's jaw tightened. "I have the legal authority to—" "You have a recommendation," Walt said. "I have the authority. That dog is shelter property until I sign the order, and I have not signed the order, and you are standing on shelter property with a firearm pursuing an animal that belongs to my facility." He paused. "You're also standing in front of a woman who was a K-9 handler for 20 years, which means she knows things about that dog up there that neither of us knows. And you are emotionally compromised, Travis. I know what this situation looks like to you. I know what it feels like. But this is not that day, and this is not that animal." The silence stretched. Somewhere up the mountain, an owl called once and went quiet. Travis's hand came off the rifle. It was a small motion, and it cost him something visible. He stepped back half a step and looked at the ground, and in the gesture there was the particular defeat of a person who has been understood rather than overcome, which is both easier and harder than the other kind. Walt reached out and took the weapon from him, checked it with the practiced efficiency of a former law enforcement officer, and set it in the back of his own vehicle. He turned back to Nora. "You know where he'll be," Walt said. It was not a question. "He'll have gone for the high ground," Nora said. "Away from the noise, somewhere defensible. The old mining tract." Walt nodded once. He looked at his watch. "The order deadline is noon. I'm giving you to noon." He stepped aside. He did not offer assistance. He did not offer company. He offered what he had always offered, the space and the time to do the thing that needed doing, and then he moved out of the way. Nora turned to face the trail. She did not look back at the vehicles at Travis standing with his eyes on the ground at Cal, who had let out a breath long enough to suggest he had been holding it for several minutes. She did not look back at the mountains behind her, at the cabin somewhere up there on the ridge where she had spent 15 years learning the wrong lesson. She faced north and she began to climb. The trail was a fire road at the base wide enough for a vehicle, its surface churned by the night's rain into a soft red mud that took her boot prints clearly and completely. She moved at a steady pace, not running, not cautious. The pace of someone covering ground with a purpose. The air was clean after the storm, carrying the smell of wet sage and pine resin, and the sky to the east was beginning to separate itself from the darkness, a thin line of gray along the peaks where the dawn was organizing itself. She read the ground as she moved. The tracks were not hard to find. A dog's paw print in the soft mud is distinct, the four toe pads, the central metacarpal pad, the absence of a heel impression that distinguishes it from human tracks. Ghost prints were large, the spread of them, wide, the depth, inconsistent in the way of an animal moving at speed without concern for its footing. In two places, she found where he had slipped the prints, smearing sideways before recovering. In one place, she found a branch snapped at chest height, the break fresh, the wood still pale and wet inside. He had not been choosing a direction. He had been fleeing one. The Sonora mine had been inactive since the early 1970s, when the vein it had been working played out, and the economics of continuing stopped making sense. What remained was the topography of extraction, flattened areas of worked rock, the ruins of a processing shed, scattered equipment too expensive to haul out and too rusted to be worth stealing, and the geological consequence of decades of digging, a landscape of fissures, overhangs, and collapsed sections where the surface had simply given way above worked-out tunnels underneath. It was the kind of place that a person who understood ground would immediately identify as offering both concealment and multiple sight lines. It was the kind of place that a dog trained in the assessment of terrain, trained to find positions that controlled elevation and reduced exposure, would move toward instinctively in the absence of any other organizing principle. Nora crested the last rise and stopped. The mine site spread before her in the early light gray and rusted and still. The processing shed had lost its roof entirely, the timber frame standing in isolation, like the ribs of something long dead. Beyond it, the worked rock extended toward the ridge, punctuated by the dark mouths of collapsed shafts. She did not call out immediately. She stood and she listened. Wind over rock. The distant drip of water somewhere below the surface. A raven somewhere on the ridge, its call sharp and brief. And underneath these barely audible, a sound that she placed before she fully heard it, the low, grinding, reluctant growl of a large dog that has been cornered and has nothing left but the performance of threat. It was coming from below her. She moved toward the sound carefully, her eyes on the ground, reading the rock for the soft margins where a surface might not hold. She found it 20 yards from the processing shed, a fissure in the worked rock roughly 8 feet wide, dropping into darkness. The collapsed entrance to a worked-out shaft, the timber, shoring long since rotted the surface above, caved in some years ago into a narrow vertical pocket. She looked down. Ghost was at the bottom. He had gone in or fallen in at full speed in the dark, and the impact and the angle of the fall had done something to his rear right leg. He was standing on 3 legs in the narrow space, his back pressed against the rock wall, his head up, his eyes in the gray dawn light below her, the color of old amber set into a face that was dirty and wet and rigid with pain and fear. He saw her and he lunged upward, snapping at the air, his claws finding no purchase on the rock face. The sound he made was not a bark. It was the sound of an animal that has used everything it has and is running on nothing but the oldest instructions it possesses. Nora sat down on the edge of the fissure. She did not think about the descent. She did not calculate it or prepare for it in any elaborate way. She simply sat on the edge, found the slope with her feet, a steep chute of loose shale 20 yards down the fissure's length that led to a narrow ledge above Ghost's position, and she pushed off. The descent was loud and undignified. The shale moved under her like water, and she rode it as much as she fought it, her hands dragging against the rock face for friction, her jacket tearing at the elbow. She hit the ledge hard enough to knock the wind from her, and sat there for a moment in the ringing quiet, her palms raw, the fingers of her left hand bleeding, where the rock had found the old scar along the palm and reopened it with casual efficiency. Ghost went frantic below her. The ledge put her 5 feet above him, close enough that she could hear the wet sound of his breathing between the bursts of snarling. He was throwing himself at the walls, at the air, at the fact of her presence in this closed space, and the leg was clearly causing him pain with each movement. She could see it in the way he landed, the involuntary compensation, the fraction of a second where the normal dog movement stuttered. Nora sat on the ledge. She let her legs hang over the edge. She put her hands on her knees. She did not use a command. She did not reach for any of the tools she had spent 15 years trying to forget and the past week trying to remember. She sat on the ledge above a broken, terrified, wounded dog in the bottom of a hole in the ground, and she simply opened her mouth and let out the thing she had been carrying for a very long time. His name was Rex, she said. Ghost snarling stuttered. The ears which had been pinned flickered once. He was the best dog I ever worked, she said. He was smarter than most people I knew, and he loved the work, the way some people love music, not because someone told him to, but because it was the thing he was built for. She looked at her bleeding hand, at the old scar reopened along the palm. I spent 15 years telling myself I gave a bad command, that he moved because of something I did wrong, that his death was mine to own. Ghost had stopped lunging. He was standing in the narrow space, his weight on 3 legs, his sides heaving. He was watching her with an intensity that was no longer purely defensive. The ears were up now, the angle of the head slightly tilted, the whole posture of an animal processing something outside the expected parameters of its experience. I was wrong, she said. He moved because of his own choice. He saw a threat that would have killed someone he was responsible for, and he didn't wait for a command, and he didn't hesitate. He just went. She paused. The wind moved somewhere above the fissure, a distant sighing. I've been hiding from that, from the fact that he was a hero, and I ran away from it instead of staying to honor it properly. Ghost made a sound. It was not a growl. It was not a bark. It was a low, uncertain vocalization, the kind a dog makes when its internal categorization of a situation has failed, and it is waiting for new information. We're both stuck in a hole, Nora said. You because of the storm. Me because I dug mine myself and climbed in and told myself it was shelter. She looked at him directly. But I'm done with it, and I'm not leaving you here. She pushed off the ledge. The drop was 5 feet, and she landed it cleanly, her knees absorbing it, her body already angled sideways rather than directly toward him. Not a threat, not a retreat, just a presence in the same space. Ghost erupted. The snarling filled the narrow rock walls and came back at them doubled, and he snapped at the air twice. And on the third snap, he stopped. He stopped because Nora had not moved. She had landed and she had stood, and she had remained exactly where she was, her hands at her sides, her face turned slightly away, breathing slowly in the cold, dark air of the shaft bottom. Not performance, not technique, just the fact of a body that was not going to do anything to him, occupying space without apology, waiting without demand. Ghost breathed. She breathed. The snarling dropped to a growl, and the growl dropped to a sound that was almost inaudible. And then there was a silence in the bottom of the shaft that had a texture to it, the silence of something being reconsidered. He came to her in increments. A step, then a pause so long she thought he had decided against it. Another step. His nose was working in the air between them with a frantic thoroughness, reading everything she was and had been and had done in the past week. She smelled of the shelter's concrete and of mountain pine and of the coffee Cal had handed her and of the particular combination of exhaustion and grief and something else, something that was perhaps the biochemical residue of a decision made irrevocably, which animals are better at detecting than people generally credit. He put his head against her chest, not gently with the full weight of it, pressing hard the broad skull, finding the space below her collarbone, and staying there. He was trembling. She could feel it through her jacket and through the flannel beneath it, the deep, fine trembling of an animal that has been afraid for so long that the fear has become structural, has become part of the way the body is organized. And the trembling is what happens when that structure begins very slowly to reconsider itself. She raised her hands. She placed them on either side of his head, her fingers in the thick, rough fur, and she held him. She did not speak. There was nothing left to say. Rex was gone and had been gone for a long time and had in the particular way that the best of them die, without hesitation, without waiting for permission, covering the person beside them, because that was the whole of the bond distilled to its most fundamental instruction. And Nora had run from that fact for 15 years and had built a life out of the running, and the life had been very quiet and very orderly and had not contained very much of what made a life worth the trouble. She held the dog in the bottom of the shaft and she cried. Not the controlled weeping of someone who has permitted themselves a measured release. The other kind, the kind that has been stored too long and comes out with the accumulated pressure of everything that was never allowed to move. Ghost pressed harder against her chest, as if he understood that the trembling he could feel was not only his own. Getting out was the problem. The slope she had descended was not climbable with a dog that could not use one of its rear legs. Ghost, once the immediate crisis had passed, demonstrated the injury clearly. The leg would not bear weight, and the attempt to use it produced a sharp involuntary cry that told her the damage was real and possibly significant. She fashioned a harness from her belt, looping it through itself until it sat across Ghost's chest and under his good foreleg, giving her something to lift from without putting pressure on the injured limb. The route out was not the route she had come in. Along the far end of the fissure, the rock had collapsed in a way that created a rough slope, steep loose, the kind of surface that demanded both hands and both feet, and a willingness to accept that progress would be slow and occasionally backward. She put Ghost on the slope ahead of her, and she climbed behind him, one hand on the harness, the other finding holds in the rock above. He did not fight her. He climbed with the focused desperation of an animal that has understood that the person behind it is part of the effort and not separate from it. When he slipped, she held. When she slipped, his weight above her on the slope served as an inadvertent anchor. They moved in the herky-jerky rhythm of two bodies learning to coordinate around each other's limitations. They came over the edge of the fissure and onto the flat-worked rock of the mine site, and they both lay there for a moment in the morning light. Ghost on his side, Nora on her back, the pale October sky above them, and the mountains beyond it, and the silence of a high place in the early morning surrounding everything. Ghost put his nose against her ear. She felt the warmth of his breath and the slight pressure of his muzzle, and she lay still and accepted it. Then she sat up. She looked at his leg. She looked at the trail leading down. She fashioned the belt back into something that would serve as a loose lead across his chest, and she got to her feet, and she said quietly and without ceremony, "Come on, soldier." He rose on three legs and walked beside her down this mountain. The group at the trailhead saw them before they heard them, two figures emerging from the tree line into the flat gravel of the parking area. Both of them marked by the descent. Both of them moving at the pace of something that has accomplished something difficult and is not yet ready to speak about it. Walt saw them first. He straightened from where he had been leaning against the interceptor, and he did not say anything. Cal made a sound that was not a word. The younger officer who had been standing by the far truck stood up straight with the instinct of someone who has just witnessed something and does not yet have a category for it. Travis saw them last. He had been sitting on the step of his vehicle, his elbows on his knees, his eyes on the gravel. He looked up when he heard the change in the quality of the silence around him, and he watched Nora and Ghost come into the light, and he watched the body that had shattered 5 days of careful work, at the sight of him, walk across the gravel on three legs with a lead so loose it was barely a formality, his whole attention on the woman beside him. Travis watched this for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked to his truck and opened the side panel where he kept his emergency equipment. He took out a professional medical kit, the large kind orange equipped for serious field injury. He carried it to the midpoint of the space between himself and Nora, and he set it down on the gravel. He did not step closer. He did not speak. He set the kit down and he stepped back, and the gesture contained everything he was apparently able to offer in that moment, which was not nothing. It was in its way considerable, the concession of a man whose fear had organized itself into procedure, and who had just watched the procedure fail to account for something important, and who was acknowledging this in the only language currently available to him. Nora looked at the kit on the ground. She looked at Travis. He was already looking away, his jaw tight, his hand, the damaged one, pressed against his side. She nodded once. He nodded back. Walt moved in then with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment to become useful. He crouched beside Ghost, running his hands along the injured leg with a careful, experienced touch. "Cal," he said, Get the clinic open. We need the portable x-ray. Cal was already moving. They carried Ghost between them, Walt at the hindquarters, Nora at the chest through the shelter's side entrance, and into the clinic where the lights came on, and the equipment came out, and the work of assessing the damage began. The leg was not broken. The x-ray showed a severe soft tissue injury to the stifle joint, the kind that heals with rest and time, and the right support. Cal splinted it with the focused competence of someone doing the thing they were trained to do, and doing it well. Ghost lay on the examination table and let them work, his eyes moving between Cal's hands and Nora's face. Walt found Nora at the door of the clinic an hour later, while Cal finished the bandaging, and Ghost lay in the post-procedure quiet that is its own particular form of exhaustion. The cottage at the back of the property, Walt said. He said it the way he said most things, without preamble, without decoration, as a simple fact placed in front of her for her consideration. Been empty since the last groundskeeper. Plumbing works. Roof is solid. It's not much. Nora looked at him. I have 3 dogs in the back I've been hiding from the county assessment, he said. A hound that won't let anyone within 10 feet of it. A shepherd mix out of a fighting situation that I've been telling the board is under evaluation. He met her eyes. I've been waiting for someone who knows what they're looking at. Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked through the clinic window at Ghost on the table, at Cal's careful hands, at the boy who had run 15 miles through a storm and fallen into a shaft and climbed out of it and walked down a mountain on 3 legs and was now lying quietly under the hands of someone who wished him well. I'll need to go up and get my things, she said. Walt nodded. That was all. He put his hands in the pockets of the old department windbreaker and walked back toward the office, and the matter was settled in the way that the best decisions are settled, without drama, without ceremony, with the simple acknowledgement that the right thing has been identified and will now be done. She drove up the mountain that afternoon. The cabin looked the same as it always had, the stacked firewood, the tools on their hooks, the rifle on the pegs above the door. She moved through it, collecting what she needed, which was not much. The rifle, the first aid kit, a change of clothes, the worn paperback with no cover that she had been using as a prop for a week and had not actually read in 3 years. The old footlocker from the back room with the few things inside it she had never been willing to discard. She stood at the window for a while before she left. The mountains were there as they had always been, the Sangre de Cristo Range, catching the late afternoon light, the peaks burning briefly in the last of the sun before the shadow of the earth began to climb them from the east. They were very beautiful. They had always been very beautiful. She had spent 15 years looking at them and seeing a wall. She picked up the footlocker, carried it to the truck, and drove down. 3 months later, the first snow of the season came to the Taos Valley on a Thursday in November, the real snow, not the tentative early dustings that came and went in October, but the committed kind that settles into the hollows and stays. It came overnight and lay still and bright on the shelter grounds in the early morning, unmarked except for the trail of 3-legged prints from the back door of the cottage to the patch of winter sun on the south side of the porch. Ghost lay in that sun with the self-possessed ease of an animal that has decided after long deliberation that the present moment is safe. His gray and white coat was thick and clean and well kept. The rear leg, when he moved, gave him a slight rolling hitch to his gait that was more pronounced in cold weather. It did not appear to trouble him. He had adjusted his way of moving around it with the pragmatic adaptability of a working animal, which is to say, he had simply gotten on with things. Nora stood at the fence on the far side of the property, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She had her jacket, on the brown leather one, repaired at the elbow, where it had torn on the fissure wall, and her hands were around a mug of coffee going cold. In front of her, in a folding chair, 6 feet from the chain-link door of an isolation run, a young man sat with his elbows on his knees. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 26, recently discharged from the Army, and he had driven 4 hours from Albuquerque because Walt had made a phone call and mentioned that there was a program and a person, and the description of both had made Marcus put down the phone and look at his hands for a long time, and then call back and say he wanted to come. Inside the run, a large hound mix sat pressed against the back wall. It was shaking. It had been shaking for 3 days. I'm not doing anything, Marcus said. His voice had the controlled flatness of someone managing something that threatened not to be manageable. I'm just sitting here and it's still shaking. I know, Nora said. How long did it take, with yours? She looked past the fence toward the cottage porch where Ghost had raised his head at the sound of her voice and was watching her with the steady proprietary attention of a dog that has decided its person is its permanent responsibility. He put his head back down when she looked at him. Longer than it should have, she said. But that wasn't the dog's fault. Marcus looked at the hound. The hound looked at the corner where the wall met the floor. What do I do? He said. Nothing, Nora said. You sit there, you breathe. You show it that the space around you is not dangerous. She looked at him at the set of his shoulders, the particular way he held his coffee cup, the stillness that was not calm but was working very hard at the appearance of calm. You already know how to do this. You've been doing it your whole life. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Is it going to be okay? He said. It was not entirely about the dog. Nora looked at the mountains to the north, at the high ridge, catching the morning sun, at the place where the sky was the deep particular blue that only comes with altitude and cold, and the specific quality of winter light in the high desert. The mountains were there as they always were, indifferent, unchanged, holding everything in their geological patience without judgment or preference. She had spent 15 years reading that indifference as permission to disappear. She understood now that it was something simpler. The mountains did not care about her, and that meant that the caring, all of it, was hers to do. The caring was not something that would be handed to her or required of her by the landscape or enforced by the altitude. It was a choice made again each morning in the direction of the valley and the town and the people and the animals and the specific hard work of being present in the world without armor. Yes, she said. She said it the way she had learned to say things that mattered without qualification, without the hedge that turns a truth into a maybe. She said it because she believed it, and she believed it because she had stopped on a highway shoulder 50 yards from a chain-link gate and turned off her engine and gotten out of the truck and picked up a three-legged stool and sat down. Everything since then had been the consequence of that one decision to stop moving away. Marcus nodded. He turned back to the hound. He adjusted his position in the chair, slightly settling his weight more evenly, and he looked at a point just to the left of the animal, rather than directly at it, and he breathed. The hound's shaking did not stop, but after a moment its nose began to work the air. Nora watched this for a while. Then she turned and walked back toward the cottage, toward Ghost on the porch, toward the mug of hot coffee Cal had left on the step, toward the list of animals Walt had given her that morning, written in his spare, efficient handwriting. 3 names, 3 brief descriptions, the quiet inventory of creatures that had not yet found the language to trust anyone and were waiting without knowing they were waiting for someone willing to sit down and stay. Ghost lifted his head when she reached the porch. His tail moved once a slow, deliberate arc. She sat down beside him in the winter sun and put her hand on his broad head and felt the warmth of him under her palm, and the mountains stood to the north exactly as they always had, and for the first time in a very long time, she was not looking at them.